Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video we're going to take a look at question 6, article 4, on whether violence can be done to the will. Now this article covers a lot more ground than that seemingly narrow question might at first indicate. This article coordinates a lot of the big ideas that Aquinas works through in the larger project of the Summa. And it can be very easy to get bogged down trying to look at those things and jumping ahead to topics that we will get to in the future. That's not really appropriate for a first pass through the article, so we will do our best to stay on target with some basics. But that does mean this article is very much worth returning to in the future after you've got a little bit more of the Summa under your belt. It will repay repeated study. One of the reasons this article is a little tricky is that it's a transitional article. In one sense, Article 4 is just completing the work that we've already been reading in Articles 1 and 3, talking about what we mean by a voluntary action. What does it mean for an action to come from within? What is voluntariness? How does that work? What does that look like when we're doing things, when we're not doing things? Article 4 more or less completes that first pass through that question. But in the other sense, we're going to the opposite. Aquinas is going to turn toward the involuntary and see it from the other side. What are the things that negate voluntariness? What is an involuntary action, and what makes actions involuntary? Properly speaking, that's what Articles 5, 6, 7, and 8 are about. But Article 4 is how we segue into that. And so it has a foot in both worlds, so to speak. And that's part of why it's a little hard to stay on topic as we work our way through it and keep the lecture tidy. This article also has a very cool, maybe tricky respondeo. I've got a few stages to it. Depending on your point of view, it's either a very fancy respondeo that demands a lot of the reader, or it's incomplete. And you can make your own judgment on that after we take a look at it. And we'll see how, in some ways, we are just pointing directly into the next article. So there's a to be continued sense, perhaps, to the respondeo, which is a little bit unusual. Finally, in a big picture sense, when you are reading this article, you should realize at some point that Aquinas is dancing around a very famous, very popular ethics term, maybe everyone's favorite magical ethics word, at least in modern ethics. And this article is really defining that magic ethics word. Now, he never says it. He very seldom brings it up directly in his work. And so we're gonna follow suit. We won't say it either until the time is right. But hopefully, partway through this article, you realize that the magic ethics word is really what we're talking about here. And hopefully you have an aha moment on that. And you will be able to tell me what it is in class. But to keep things practical and to keep things simple for a first pass through this article, I think the first-time reader needs to spend their attention primarily on the word violence. What does that word mean? It's important not to assume that we know what Aquinas means when he says violence. At each stage of this article, he's giving some partial definition of the word, what he means by it. And the student job is to assemble all of those pieces into a whole. What does Aquinas mean when he says violence? Read this article to find out. Actually, part of the answer is in Article 5, but you can get quite a lot of it here. And so if you approach this article as a little bit of a mystery to solve, how do we put together all the pieces of the word violence, that should keep you focused on the important parts for a first pass. I will certainly ask my students to do this on a quiz or assessment of some sort. So let's take a look at the objections. And I'm a little ambivalent about how many of these objections to look at. You certainly have to be able to explain what's going on in the first two objections. They're both very important for the respondeo, and they both have very good answers to them, very worthwhile. And not too complicated. A student should be able to read them, understand them, and explain them. The third objection, however, is a little bit messy. We are going to take a look at it. It introduces an idea that's quite important for the article. If it were only for that, we would probably gloss over most of it. However, as we'll see when we get to it, it brings up several other very worthwhile ideas for the future. And so we're going to get into it a little bit, which I suppose breaks my promise not to get carried away coordinating with other parts of the Summa. But we're going to try to keep that to a minimum. And perhaps we'll spend too much time on objection 3, but it's my video. So objection 1, which is a great what about God kind of objection. Usually when God is invoked in an objection, it's either a very serious and profound objection, or it's a very humorous one. I find this one to be a little bit on the humorous side. It would seem that violence can be done to the will. For everything can be compelled by that which is more powerful. But there is something, namely God, that is more powerful than the human will, therefore it can be compelled, at least by him, at least by God. Now, before we get to the God part, there's actually several things to look at here. First of all, since we're still early in the Summa, let's remind ourselves that when you see the first line of the first objection, that tells you the general direction of the article. It would seem that violence can be done to the will, and that means that as we go through the article, Aquinas is going to somehow argue that that's not true, that violence cannot be done to the will, somehow. We don't know how yet. But he's going to take a position that is in some way counter to this. But then notice that he quickly shifts to a different term. He begins by talking about violence and then, without explanation, starts talking about being compelled or compulsion. Clearly, he thinks that the terms are interchangeable or synonymous, or that there's some sort of link to there. It's some sort of partial definition of violence, perhaps. But he doesn't argue for it. When we see a terminological shift like that, we need to take note of it. Sometimes that's a perfectly reasonable shorthand. We've skipped a step that's not too hard. Sometimes it's the question that we're supposed to be asking ourselves. How does this work? Sometimes it's sophistry. Swapping terms out in an argument is a way to play a shell game and distract someone from the truth. So this ends up being a great starting puzzle for the article. Why should we connect violence and compulsion? It's probably worth thinking about when we would agree that those terms go together and when they would not. So are there times where we are compelled and that we would say that's violent? Are there times where we are being compelled without violence? And are there times where violence is being done to us and we're not being compelled? We'll see this again as we go through the article. We'll see more about this. But if this is a good thing to think through before you even really get started on the article. Maybe we have a further problem that it's not obvious what being compelled means. So not only do we not know exactly what Aquinas means by violence, maybe we don't know exactly what it means by compelled. So you need to think through these terms and the way they're connected. The obvious thing here is that Aquinas thinks that compulsion has something to do with power or the application of force. Everything can be compelled by that which is more powerful. Okay. Setting aside that puzzle, how those terms relate to each other, the rest of the objection is pretty easy. Assuming we can make those links, well, there's definitely at least one thing stronger than the will. We don't have to know the complete list. Maybe there's lots of things stronger than the human will. Maybe there's only one, but there's definitely one. It's God, right? God's omnipotent. We're not. God is infinite. The will is not. So at the very least, the will can be compelled by God, right? This seems simple enough. And just to dwell on the argument point for a moment, just the basic logical point, if you want to show that the will can be compelled, you only have to show one thing that can compel it. If it can be compelled by one thing, it can be compelled. If there's one thing stronger than the will, then there's something stronger than the will. And that's all you need here. We can be agnostic about how many other things are stronger than the will. Now, the answer to this objection is not very difficult if you read the respondeo of the article. And in that sense, the reply to this objection is just the next or last paragraph of the respondeo. It's a nice example for closing off the discussion of the respondeo. You could derive it yourself, I think. I don't think you really have to read the reply to this objection if you understand the respondeo of Article 4 and some things that we said in the previous video in Article 3. And that's objection 1. Now, objection 2 is hopefully very familiar to you. It should ring a bell. Every passive subject is compelled by its active principle when it is changed by it. But the will is a passive force, for it is a mover moved. Therefore, since it is sometimes moved by its active principle, it seems that sometimes it is compelled. Hopefully you recognize that this is very similar to what we did in Article 3. We are once again looking at Aristotle's theory of change, passive, active, changed. This is an act and potency claim. Also very similar to Article 1. This is probably the clearest way in which this article is completing the work of the previous articles. And I think that this is the most important objection for the respondeo, for a couple of reasons. It does give some of the format of how he's going to answer it. This seems to be the one that he's speaking toward. But it's also a very serious challenge to what Aquinas has already said in previous articles, specifically Article 1. With a keen eye, you should see that this is nothing other than the very first thing we read. Question 6, Article 1, Objection 1, and its reply. And you can think of this objector as either challenging that reply, calling it into question, asking for clarification, or forgetting it. Somehow we're just passing through that same issue. Not every principle is a first principle and that sort of thing. But we're hitting it from a different angle. The other thing to comment on here, I think, is the word sometimes. The will is a passive force. It's a potency in some way. It's a mover moved. Therefore, since it is sometimes moved by its active principle, it seems that sometimes it is compelled. Anytime you see someone say sometimes, you should immediately have two questions. When and when not? When is it moved by its active principle? And when is it not? And if you realize that we're just recasting question 6, Article 1, hopefully you can see that what we're talking about here is just the way the appetible object moves the will, moves the voluntas. But if that's right, if we're talking about the way that the appetible activates the will, or the way the will as an appetite responds to the appetible, then the answer to when is always, every single time the will responds to an object as appetible or desirable. Every single time the will moves towards something as a good, I want that. It's being compelled. That's a very strong claim. And it seems to contradict what Aquinas was aiming for in Article 1. Now again, maybe we need to be clearer on what we mean by compelled. We're going to get some clarity on that in a bit. But it seems to be raising some serious problems there. It's remarkably similar to modern accounts that deny the reality of the magic ethics word that we're not going to say. And Aquinas is obviously not going to deny the reality of the magic ethics word. So it's of great interest to us how he will answer this and what more he will say on this as compared to Article 1, reply to objection 1. But I also told you to look at the when not side of things. If it's sometimes moved by its active principle, we should at least wonder if that sometimes it really means always, or if are there times when it's not. Based on what we've looked at so far, there is no obvious when not. But this does hint at another way of seeing what the will does. And we've already seen it in Article 3, and it's going to feature prominently in this respondeo. It's part of why this respondeo is complicated, because we need to grapple with the way the will is moved by objects and the way the will does something else. If you step back for a moment, though, like even aside from the ethics concern, the claim that the objector is making is really strong, maybe way too strong. It seems to suggest that every change in the universe is compulsion. So again, do we know what compulsion means? That might be a worry. And if we can link it to what the first objector was doing, remember the first objector started by talking about violence and then transitioned to compulsion without comment. If the second objector can be understood in the same vein, then this guy is arguing that every change in the universe is violent. That might be a strange result. Maybe not. Let's find out. Finally, Article 3, or Objection 3, I'm sorry. The one that I'm not sure I should be going over. Here's the reason we have to look at it. This idea in the very beginning of the objection is how we're going to talk to the other objectors. It's going to feature in the respondeo. It's a very important idea. Violent movement is that which is contrary to nature. There's our new piece. But the movement of the will is sometimes contrary to nature, as is clear of the will's movement to sin, which is contrary to nature, as Damascene says, St. John of Damascus. Therefore, the movement of the will can be compelled. The reason not to look at this, at least for me as your teacher primarily, is that he's talking about sin. And I don't want to talk about sin yet. We haven't gotten to the discussion of moral good and evil. What does it mean for an action to be bad? And in general, I don't like it when Aquinas borrows from the future, borrows from his future topics, future discussions that he hasn't gotten to yet to explain something in the lead up to those topics. Drives me a little bit crazy. Now, granted, we could, as we've sort of done with violence and compulsion, we begin with some vague notion of what we mean by sin or evil, but I'd rather deal with this question about evil later. But the objection itself, and what it's assuming, and Aquinas' answer to the objection, essentially dominates everything Aquinas talks about for the next many, many, many questions, really the rest of the semester of ethics. This is such an important objection and reply that it feels wrong to just skip it. So let's look at it a little bit more closely. Violent movement is that which is contrary to nature, contra naturam. There's nothing fancy going on with the Latin there. It's typical in modern, contemporary treatments of Aquinas, or just Catholic Church teaching in general, to spend a lot of time trying to explain what Aquinas means by nature or contrary to nature, or what the fathers, what the tradition in general means by nature or contrary to nature, trying to disambiguate. And I think a lot of those treatments are not a waste of time, but we get bogged down in a lot of details that don't matter. I think they're often not helpful. What Aquinas means here, as is clear the further you read, I think, is the sense of nature that Aquinas associates with essence, with the definition of a species. That's the first time that Aquinas uses this language of nature in the Summa, is at the very beginning, the prima pars, question 3 on divine simplicity. A question that my Form 3 students look at, although only briefly, early in their careers at St. Anselm's, when we're talking about the ways God is not composed of parts. One of those is that God is not composed of essence and existence. And he talks about nature. Essence or nature, which Aquinas thinks are either synonymous or very similar, very closely related, indicate or connote what pertains to the definition of the species. The way humanity connotes everything that pertains to the definition of human. Right? So human is a kind of thing. The definition of human, all that goes into being human, all that is held in common among all humans, that's human nature. Or perhaps interchangeably, that's the essence of what it means to be human. The language of nature is probably most familiar to students of the Catholic tradition when it comes to the incarnation. For many, many, many centuries now, we've used the language of nature to try to explain, to talk about what's going on in Jesus Christ. The second person of the Trinity, in becoming one of us, in becoming man, assumes a human nature. All that pertains to the definition of the human, he takes on. He makes it a part of himself, although that's not right. We shouldn't say part, but whatever. This isn't a dogmatics class right now. We'll be a little clumsy with the language. So we say that Jesus Christ has two natures. He's fully human and fully divine. We could be a little more precise in the language, but that's good enough for what we mean right here with nature. It's a kind of thing. And now what Aquinas wants to say is that violence is some kind of motion, some kind of action, some kind of change on a thing contrary to the nature of that thing, contrary to what kind of thing it is. Now, in order to get any deeper into what we mean by contrary to nature, we would have to branch off into all those big topics that I'm trying not to get too far into in this video. But a very keen-eyed reader might recognize a very important argument or family of ideas from my Form 3 religion class. And if you don't recognize it yet, that's okay, because very soon we're going to have to review it, because Aquinas is going to make it a key part of his ethics shortly. This language of being contrary to the kind of thing that it is, as opposed to in accord with the kind of thing that it is part of how we talked about good and evil when we did the convertibility argument and the privation theory of evil. And that is where we are going. But we don't want to dive too far into that right now. The will is moved contrary to nature when we sin. It's not immediately obvious, I think, from the text if we mean the will is moved contrary to its nature, or we are moved contrary to our nature. And maybe those are synonymous. Maybe the difference doesn't matter. The will is moved this way when we sin. Now, don't worry about the John of Damascus citation. St. John of Damascus is going over the privation theory of evil there in his own way. And we're going to look at that later. But I think it's worth asking, how so? The will is moved this way when we sin. Really? How? What is going on? When the will is... What Aquinas is saying is that when the will responds to an evil object as a pedible, that evil object is moving us, and that motion is violent. It's contrary to our nature, or contrary to the nature of the will, one or the other, possibly just both. How so? That's worth pondering. That's worth meditating on, even if we're not going to get a technical answer the way Aquinas would say it right away. We'll get to that. This is a great thing to return to after we've made our way down several more questions. But even now, what does it mean to say that when we will evils, when evils are appetible to us, we are being moved contrary to our nature? That's worth some personal thought if you want this ethics class to be more than just memorizing a bunch of things that Aquinas said. Now, one last thing on this objection before we wrap this up. I want you to notice the terms shift again, just like in objection 1. We begin by talking about violent movement as being contrary to nature, and that the will is sometimes moved contrary to nature. If we're going to mind our P's and Q's, if we're going to draw the explicit conclusion, what Aquinas should write is that the movement of the will is sometimes violent, or that the will is sometimes moved violently. But notice that the objector makes the same interchanging move that the first objector did. instead of concluding that the will is moved violently, he concludes that the movement of the will can be compelled. So once again, we're confronted with, is this a shell game? Is this sophistry? Or is there some essential link between compulsion, violence, and nature, being contrary to nature? What is that link? Why does he keep doing this? So all three of those objections are to claim that the will can be compelled, and based on the logic, the formatting of the Summa, that means we need an opposite position. Right? Against all of that, St. Thomas invokes St. Augustine. This is St. Augustine from City of God, Book 5, I believe. This is where Augustine is talking about fate and predestination. He's critiquing those ideas. He's criticizing them. And this isn't a direct quotation of Augustine from that chapter and book. I think it's Book 5, Chapter 10, maybe. But Augustine is talking about these same things that Aquinas is talking about. And this is how the sed contra reads. What is done by the will is not done of necessity. Now, whatever is done under compulsion is done of necessity. Consequently, what is done by the will cannot be compelled, or maybe we should just say is not compelled. Therefore, the will cannot be compelled. This language of necessity is a nice way to refine what we've said by compulsion. When something is compelled, the resultant motion or change happens of necessity. It happens necessarily. And what Augustine is doing, and what Aquinas wants to borrow from him, is the idea that the will doesn't move that way. We're contrasting two modes of motion here. We are, in fact, in some way just talking about the nature of the will, just like the third objector brought up this idea of nature. What is done by the will is not done of necessity. Well, what is the opposite of necessity? What is the opposite of necessary movement? You have necessary movement, and then you have magic ethics word movement. Something can be moving necessarily, or it can be moving magic ethics wordly, adverbially. Right? So whether you're using it as an adjective or an adverb or a noun, you need to see what the opposite of necessity is, or necessary, or necessarily. And it's not unnecessary or non-necessary. Don't throw a negating prefix on it. It's its own word. It's an interesting sed contra because in some sense it looks like a naked appeal to authority. We're committed to what St. Augustine wrote about in City of God. We're not going to throw out his critique of fate and predestination, divine foreknowledge and whatnot. His treatment of divine foreknowledge, that's fine. It's a little less, it's unclear if this is just giving us some essential ingredient, talking about the language of necessity. It's not exactly giving us the answer. It's just giving us some things we need in order to get to the answer, perhaps. That's a little bit of an uncertain, I think, sed contra. It's certainly not the same kind of sed contra as Article 3, which is a very different kind. It's almost a hybrid of the appeal to authority in the first article and the more argumentative claim in the third article. All right, so those are our ingredients, objections 1, 2, and 3 in the sed contra. How is Aquinas going to cook all these together into an answer on what is going on with the will? How does it move? How does it not move? Can violence be done to it? As happens in almost every article of the Summa, we'll begin with a distinction. The act of the will is twofold. There's your distinction language. One is its immediate act, as it were elicited by it, namely to wish. And like I said in the Article 3 video, I don't use to wish there. I say to will. I'm not a fan of that translation. The other act of the will is an act of the will commanded by it and put into execution by means of some other power, such as to walk and to speak, which are commanded by the will to be executed by means of the motive power. Now, at one level, you should recognize this distinction from Article 3 when we were talking about, I want to read or I don't want to do my homework, and we distinguished the willing part and the doing part, right? The action of willing and the action being willed. And that was important in the negations game we played in Article 3. This distinction is a little bit more subtle than that. He's doing more than just contrasting the willing and the doing. And a complete account of what he's doing here probably has to wait for the future. This will be clearer as we go through questions 11 through 17, when we give Aquinas' theory of practical reason. That's the primary independent project for my students, so that we won't have a video series on that. That's for you guys to figure out on your own with a little bit of direction from me. But now we want to distinguish two parts of the willing: the immediate act and the act of the will commanded by the will, or commanded by that immediate act. The terminology here is slightly unclear on its own, not just in English. The Latin is a little odd as well. This is one of the rabbit holes we could go down, fresh translation and all that. We're not going to. So, borrowing just a little bit from other things he says on this, we're contrasting the simple act of willing to go for a walk, the way a walk in the park appeals to me, the way it moves my appetite, the way it moves the will. But then there's also the way that the will commands and directs my walking and makes it voluntary. So there's the way the will is moved, and then there's the way the will moves. The way we are willing some object, some thing that we like, that we want, and the way we are willing the doing that gets us to it. And this distinction we're going to exploit for a long, long time. This is very important for question 8 and 11 through 17 and 8 and on and on and on. You should recognize, I hope, from the first objection, the sometimes. I'm sorry, the second objection. The sometimes in the second objection, sometimes moved this way, sometimes not. So actually tracks with this distinction. So there's our distinction, and that means we need to give an answer for the immediate act and for the act of the will commanded by it. These two ways of looking at willing, or the two sides of willing, if you will. So then we go on to apply the distinction. We're going to exploit it. He's going to give his answer. He's going to state his conclusion and then reason about it. As regards the commanded acts of the will, then, the will can suffer violence, insofar as violence can prevent the exterior members from executing the will's command. But as to the will's own proper act, violence cannot be done to the will. Worth noting, I think, that he's reversed the order of presentation. In the previous slide, he first talked about the will's own act, the simple act, and then talked about the acts commanded. Now he's reversed it for stating the conclusion. That might just be style. It might be substantive. There might be a reason he's done it that way. But basically all we have here is the conclusion given for each branch of the distinction. When we want to go walking, not in a vague sense, but like I will it right now, and we are prevented from walking, then our will is being frustrated. Violence is being done to the will because it's commanding, but the command is being frustrated or stopped. It's working contrary to its nature somehow. However, this direct or very simple sense of compelling the voluntas, moving the voluntas directly, the will's own proper act cannot be violated. It cannot be compelled. And the meaning of the sense of cannot there is meant to be very, very strong, as we're going to see. So now we get to the fancy part, the reason. Here's the argument. We state a distinction, we give the bottom line answer, now we give the reason for it, nice and methodical. Hopefully you recognize the reasoning. The reason of this is that the act of the will is nothing else than an inclination proceeding from the interior principle of knowledge. Just as the natural appetite is an inclination proceeding from an interior principle without knowledge. But what is compelled or violent is from an exterior principle. not an interior. Consequently, it is contrary to the nature of the will's own act that it should be subject to compulsion and violence. If you do not recognize that this is just the language of question 6, article 1, you need to go back to question 6, article 1. It's all here again. Inclination, it doesn't say, yeah, there it is, natural appetite. Inclination, appetite, intrinsic principle of motion, extrinsic principle of motion, principle of knowledge. It's not on this slide, it's on the next slide, but even the example of the stone is used again. It's just a second pass at the respondeo of question 6, article 1. So what he's saying here is, if you really understood what we said in question 6, article 1, you already know the answer to this. You can't think of the will, the voluntas, or its act, as like a substance. It's not a billiard ball. It's not a body or a thing that gets moved around. It's a principle of motion. It's an inclination proceeding from the interior principle of knowledge. What is compelled or violent is from an exterior principle. It is contrary to the nature of the will's own act that it should be subject to compulsion and violence. So first, notice also that we've got objection 3 and the language of contrary to nature used here. However, the way he's using it is a little different. Objector 3 wanted to say that when you move a thing contrary to its nature, you're doing violence to it. It sounds like Aquinas is saying we're moving, contrary to the nature of the will, so we're doing violence to it, but actually he's saying the opposite. No, it can't happen. Contrary to nature is being repurposed or maybe clarified. Maybe that's the mistake the third objector made, sort of unclear right now. But it's being repurposed to make a stronger claim than what the objector was going for. The either fancy or incomplete aspect to this respondeo is that what he's written here, he's only talking about the simple act of the will. He hasn't said anything about the commanded acts of the will, the command side of it, and he's not going to. So he gives you a distinction, and he gives you an answer for each branch of the distinction. But then the reasoning that he gives applies primarily and perhaps exclusively to that simple act of the will. That means he never gives a reason for what he says to the first branch. Now, possibly, we are supposed to see that he's doing something tricky here. He's being sophisticated. What he's saying about contrary to nature, the way he's saying it, and the way he talks through his examples on the next slide that we're going to see in just a moment, perhaps it indicates a way to reason for the other conclusion that he's not talking about, the command side of the will. And so it's left to the reader to see that and to do it. It's also possible that we're just supposed to wait for Article 5. He will directly address this in the next article, although not at great length, pretty directly, pretty simply. If we see Article 4 as a standalone, then we're left with this stated conclusion that doesn't seem to have a lot going for it, unless we're supposed to do the work for him, which is possible. Is it sophisticated or is it awkward? Doesn't matter, you got to know it either way. So I'm just picking up from where he left off on the previous slide and restating a little bit. What is compelled or violent is from an exterior principle. Consequently, it is contrary to the nature of the will's own act that it should be subject to compulsion and violence. That's where we stopped on the previous slide. Just as it is also contrary to the nature of a natural inclination or movement. And then he gives 2 examples, one of which is the stone. In one sense, Aquinas just wants to state a very simple contradiction. Voluntas, will, V in the diagram that I use, it just means that the motion arises from within us. That's Article 1. But violence means that the motion arises from outside of us, from without. Because of that, the will can't be compelled. And it has nothing to do with power. It has nothing to do with, there's nothing strong enough to do it. It's that it's gibberish. it's logically impossible to compel the simple act of the will. It doesn't mean anything. The notion of power never has to enter into the equation based on the way Aquinas is arguing here. So instead of talking about contrary to nature as being, the standard by which we judge a thing to be violent, now Aquinas is using it to basically introduce a contradiction, a simple, like a really direct one. If we could state it this way, as I've sort of sketched out at the bottom, if we were to say that the simple act of the will can be compelled, what we would really be saying is that some object is moved by an extrinsic principle contrary to its nature and simultaneously is moving itself in accord with its nature at the same time and in the same respect. And that is impossible. It's impossible in the same way that God can't make a rock so big he can't lift it, because nothing is beyond, in the Anselmian sense. It would imply an impotency in God. God can't have lacks of powers. And in the same way that you can't have, a triangle with 4 sides and interior angles summing to 711 degrees. And it doesn't make any sense to say, well, maybe we just haven't found one yet. It's like, no, that's contrary to what is meant by triangle. That's not what a triangle is. I think the second example that it gives is helpful. You should think it through in more than one scenario, right? Maybe worth discussing in class. You could drag someone by force. Right? Like, you want to stay in the classroom, and I'm going to drag you out. You want to stay in the restaurant. You want to stay at the protest and continue protesting. And someone grabs you by the ankles and drags you forcefully away, kicking and screaming, literally, contrary to what it is that you will. That's fine. Aquinas isn't saying you can't be compelled. He's saying that the intrinsic principle of motion within you can't be compelled, because then there is no intrinsic principle of motion. It's contrary to the very notion of violence that you be dragged kicking and screaming of your own will. If you will it, if you're like, okay, fine, I'd rather leave anyway, then you're no longer being dragged forcefully. It's no longer violence in the way Aquinas means it. You might be being dragged, but now it's like just for fun, like you're being physically dragged. The way you drag your siblings around the house in some dumb game or whatever before someone hits their head on a coffee table and gets hurt and starts crying and blames you and calls for mom. So Aquinas is making a really, really, really strong claim, and he's dismissing as irrelevant the power question that the first objector brought up. And I think turning to the reply to the first objection is another way to try to clarify what he's getting at in the respondeo. So let's look at that. And when we clear up some of that, it might make it a little easier to see what Aquinas is saying and what he's not. So obviously the first objector claimed that God is more powerful than the human will, and compulsion is what a more powerful thing does to a weaker thing. And we're not going to, well, actually, with the will and God's omnipotence and things like that. No, that's right. God is more powerful than the human will. God, who is more powerful than the human will, can move the will of man, according to Proverbs 21. Beautiful citation. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. Whithersoever he will, he shall turn it. Meaning God turns the heart of the king in whatever direction he wants. But if this moving, if this turning were by compulsion, it would no longer be by an act of the will, nor would the will itself be moved, but something else against the will. So obviously we're going to concede the first premise, but then we just want to make the same kind of claim as the respondent. We're just going to say it again in a slightly different way. You have to see the difference between moving the will and compelling the will. Aquinas has already looked at this in, again, question 6, article 1, reply to objection 3. We're just returning to it. He lists the 3 ways that God moves the will. And this Proverbs citation is beautiful. And maybe shows yet another way. It's actually ambiguous about how God is moving it. How does God move the heart of the king or the will? It's some kind of mystery of divine providence. God achieves this desired outcome of the king's heart being turned in some way or another but he does so through our voluntary actions. God's omnipotence, God's divine providence exceeds anything that we can really imagine. God doesn't get what he wants by making us into puppets. Notice this, if this were by compulsion, it would no longer be by an act of the will. We'd essentially be circumventing the will. Right? Like, okay, so now the king is doing something different because God made him. But that doesn't mean God made him will it. It just means the king is now doing something different. And this idea of moving V versus replacing it might be another way to see what's going on here. Obviously, God is stronger than we are. God can compel us to do things. God can compel us to do anything, basically. Anything that isn't gibberish, anything that's not logically impossible. God can compel us to do anything. And God does move us to will things. He moves us as the first mover, and he moves us in the ways that Aquinas talks about in Article 1, reply to objection 3. He softens the heart with grace. He moves us by grace. He sends prophets and apostles to admonish and to exhort. He takes on human nature and says, hey, everybody, I've got great news. In all of these ways, God moves the will, and other ways. But it's not just that God doesn't compel us. It's not just that God doesn't compel the will. It's that God cannot compel the will. My students get this wrong every year. I'm not sure if it's because they're not paying attention and then they go look up on Google what they think the answer ought to be, or if I'm just butting heads with something that they hold very deeply, or if they just can't see the difference here between compelling us to do things and compelling us to will things. The fact that God is infinitely powerful is irrelevant. God cannot compel our will. And every year I ask my students to explain why, and every year a significant number of my students, despite me giving this warning, every year they say God can't compel the will because God gave us free will, and it would be inconsistent with his nature to take back something that he'd given us. Maybe, but totally irrelevant for explaining reply to objection 1. That's not what Aquinas says. It has nothing to do with what Aquinas says. Or God can compel the will, obviously, he's omnipotent, but God loves us. God's all good. He would never do violence to us. Beautiful sentiment, wrong in some ways perhaps, but also, again, totally irrelevant. Totally irrelevant. When Aquinas says God cannot, he means it is impossible. God can make us do things, can't make us will things. And what's interesting is this is basically what the book of the prophet Jonah is about, or it's one of its major themes, right? Jonah, go to Nineveh, preach repentance to the people of Nineveh. I want to have mercy on them. No, why would I want to do that? Nineveh is our enemy. They're oppressing us. I want you to destroy them. If they repent, you will forgive them because you're all merciful, and I don't want you to have mercy on them. I want you to destroy them. I'm not going to Nineveh. Jonah, go to Nineveh right now. What are you going to do? Make me? Giant fish. God makes Jonah go to Nineveh, but it's very clear that at no point in that part of the story does Jonah will going to Nineveh. He's fleeing he's fleeing on a ship when the thing swallows him. It's interesting that it's almost exactly the point that the prophet Jonah, the book of Jonah, is trying to make, what Aquinas is saying here. Very, very similar. It's not the only thing going on in the prophet Jonah. After Jonah does it very reluctantly, he's furious the whole time. Right? Now he's cowed now, so he realizes the futility of struggling against God, but he's angry the whole time. And after he preaches repentance and the people of Nineveh repent, Jonah storms out of the city and throws himself down in the dust and prays for death. He's furious with God and with this outcome. And that's how the book ends. God shows up and asks him, are you mad? And Jonah's screaming at God, yes, I'm mad. This is exactly what I told you would happen. How could I not be mad? And God says, I mean, I'm God. It's all mine. Who are you? I have mercy on who I want to have mercy on. And then the book's over. Now, there's lots of other important lessons there, probably most famously that we hate God's mercy for others and sometimes for ourselves. That might be the most important part. But the book of Jonah is actually illustrating this point that Aquinas is trying to make. And it's not just that God doesn't compel wills, it's that he cannot, because it would simply be replacing an intrinsic principle with an extrinsic principle, which God can do, but that's not compelling the will. That's compelling the human. Now, reply to objection 2. It's not always a violent movement when a passive subject is moved by its active principle, but only when this is done against the interior inclination of the passive subject. So we're just refining the link between violence and compulsion by bringing in objection 3 again. Hopefully you can see it. Against the interior inclination of the passive subject is interchangeable with contrary to the nature of the passive subject. At least when we're talking about humans. Yeah, no, for everything. And if you don't do that, if you don't bring in the contrary to nature idea here to make clear what's going on about the difference between violence and compulsion, then you end up with exactly the worry that I raised when we were looking at the objection. Every alteration and generation of simple bodies would be unnatural and violent. Every change in the universe would be violence. That's not just an odd result. That is making a mockery of the terms to begin with. Like, the whole reason we brought up violence was to talk about a particular kind of motion. But now we're saying that violence is simply synonymous with change. Violence is change and change is violence. So there's no reason to be talking about violence in the first place. It just changes. There are also unhappy results there. Every time you change your mind, it's violence. Every time you are persuaded, it's violence. Every time you grow taller, it's violence. Now, we could also link this to the Aristotelian account of natural and violent motion, but I don't think that's, and Aquinas has that going on in the background here. But that's a tangent for us. I don't think that matters. We can say enough just with these few points here. The distinction between violence and compulsion as having to do somehow with contrary to nature is very important, or a lot of things get really weird really fast. And that just brings us to reply to objection 3. I can't tell you how important this reply is. I can't express it sufficiently. That to which the will tends by sinning, although in reality it is evil and contrary to the rational nature, nevertheless is apprehended as something good and suitable to nature, insofar as it is suitable to man by reason of some pleasurable sensation or some vicious habit. Right, the objection was that sometimes the will is moved by evils, and that means that it's moved contrary to its own nature. And based on the way we've argued in the respondeo, if the will is never moved contrary to nature, then how do we sin? We've actually, in some ways, intensified the problem of the objection by going through the respondeo and the answer that Aquinas has given. And the answer that he gives here is that the will is being moved by an evil which is being apprehended as a good. Now, I've said this in simple form to my Form 3 students before, but this is going to be absolutely essential for almost every article we read for the rest of the semester. We will use this idea so many times. You'll be sick of it. And since this is the first time we see it clearly, I figured we should mark it as historically important as for you as students. This is a top 3 Aquinas idea. It's necessarily connected to the convertibility of transcendentals and the privation theory of evil, things that my students in Form 3 learned once long ago, and I promised them they would have to know for forever, meaning until they finish ethics, and which we will be getting into very soon. Although not quite yet. But just to mark this answer, and maybe spend a little bit of time meditating on it, just like we meditated on how are we being moved contrary to our nature when we do evil. Think about those. Studying ethics shouldn't just be memorizing a bunch of ideas on Aquinas. And that is the end of question 6, article 4. Or at least the end of our first pass through it. If you have any questions about this article, or indeed anything at all pertaining to ethics or anything, you know how to get a hold of me. Comments down below, all my various school contact information. And in the meantime, good luck with your studying, and God bless.